that what you would have to say would have a power and an authority of its own, as it has proved to be in what you've shared with us. But for those who don't know much about your person, your publications, your work, I put a link on the chat room through to your website, which people can consult. But I do want to say, before opening up to discussion, how fortunate we are in Regent's Park College and in the University of Oxford to have your presence. You spoke about two factors at the end of your speech: vulnerability and disturbingness. And I think we have to acknowledge that by accepting the call to this role that you have done, you are, in the words that you often use, making yourself as a black-bodied theologian vulnerable. But you come bringing a proper and a right disturbance at a time when it is good that that should happen. And I know you've been widely involved also, not just in the centre and in our college, but also in the university in current debates and initiatives around the university's own inheritance in relation to colonialism and manifestations today. And so you come to us embodying and enacting what it is that you've spoken of this evening. So thank you. We have now at least a good 15 minutes, and we can go on for up to half an hour, I think, before we close, for those of you who are able to remain. And please to pose questions or make comments for Anthony. We have around 50 people here, 60 people here, so I shall do my best to keep an eye on when hands are being raised, as per, if possible, the Zoom screen, the raise hand symbol, and I will try and bring you in as and when in order. But like I say, keeping track of 60 people is a challenge, but it's also a testament that we've got so many people here tonight. So let's open up now for discussion and debate. So I've got three, and I didn't see which one popped up first, so I'll say Beth Dodd, Martin Woodsford, and Andrew Taylor. We'll do the three of you. We'll take Beth first and then see if you want to respond, Anthony, or whether you want to take another question or comment and then respond. We'll improvise in a jazz way.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if this is what Paul was alluding to, but you mentioned very briefly, Anthony, about the current government policy and things in the news about the treatment of statues. I grew up in a church where there was a church split over a plaque and whether to keep it or not. I grew up in a Baptist church. So I wondered if you wanted to speak to that issue either within a church context or within the context of the University of Oxford.
Yeah, I mean...
Okay, do you want to come in on that directly, Anthony? Or, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think very, very quickly. I mean, I think I'm all for, well, I mean, in terms of, I mean, I don't start speaking in terms of the plaque in terms of churches. I mean, I was in a church that split over the size of plates. I mean, you know, that's not even as I get into that one here. I mean, literally size, you know, big plates versus small plates. So yeah. I think we clearly need a discussion, a debate around statues and their places. I mean, I cheered when Coulson was thrown into the harbour, although in hindsight, the truth is it should never come to that, because actually, like, there was a 30-year campaign simply to have a conversation that Bristol City Council refused to have. So my view, I think, around the statues in Oxford is what we first need is a conversation. And to acknowledge that history is not simple, it is contested, and there'll be different perspectives on that. What we have not had thus far is even the conversation. So even when the issue was raised a number of years ago, I think it was Patton who was then, I think, the Chancellor, whose simple dictate was, if you don't like it, then don't come to Oxford. Yes, so therefore, so what we're modelling to our students is no dialogue whatsoever. So I think, at the very least, what we need is dialogue and conversation. As I said, you know, I mean, I did cheer when Coulson was thrown into the water. I can't deny it, but hopefully that should not be the norm. The norm should be, actually, let's have conversations and let's just acknowledge that British history is contested, it's complicated, there's no one simple narrative, and hopefully what the Christian perspective can bring is a nuanced complication to that conversation.
Thank you, Anthony. Martin Woodsford.
Anthony, I was just wondering about the rest of the band in a jazz band. The preacher as soloist, I think, is appropriate and would drive it forward, but what do the rest of them do in this context?
That's a great question, and that's where my completely amateurish skills come here, because I have to say I have no skill whatsoever in terms of being a jazz musician, so this is purely theoretical here. I think that's where the other components of worship actually come in. So therefore, I think that the rest of the band is the organist, or the accompanist. Certainly in many churches now, like we will probably literally have a group of musicians who will play. It's the people who do the reading. It's all the various components, including the congregation, that help to feed into that. I think if I think back and using that analogy, which of course that is not a perfect one, and I can see sort of gaps and holes in it already, that one of the problems with my training when I was trained to be a lay preacher is that we were trained not to be a one-man band. So basically you were trained to do everything. And basically you therefore did not ask anyone to do anything, except maybe if it was a larger congregation, like you might get someone like to do a reading or two for you, but like you do the prayers and everything. And that was almost like the very egotistical soloist who has no regard like for the people they're playing with. But actually, if you talk to any really good jazz musician, what they say is that they will say that nothing beats having good sidemen, nothing beats having good people you play with, because actually they don't detract from you, they enhance you. They enhance you. And I think it's a bad preacher that turns up assuming that it's all about them, and assume that the input and the contribution of other people does not significantly impact upon their worship. So now, actually, when I go to a place to preach, I will often try to have some type of consultation with a group of people to say, actually, rather than me just turn up and just pick out my head someday I'm going to preach with you, actually, let's make this a collaborative enterprise. So what are the issues that you're wrestling with at the moment? How do we share worship? I tend not to choose the hymns. I tend not to lead the worship. And let other people who are local to that context do that, because they will do it in a way that's authentic to that place, rather than me just turn up and doing my thing. So so I can see the limits of the analogy, but I still think that the rest of the band can be likened to the other ingredients in worship, where other people are participating alongside the preacher.
Here we are. For those of you who are not watching, on the chat discussion, you can keep an eye on people who are reacting and improvising as we go, as well as speaking. So have a look at what people are saying in chat as well. But we come now to Andrew Taylor's question or comment, intervention.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Anthony. I'm sorry I can't be seen by everyone. I think it's time for a new laptop, but it's been time for a new laptop for about a year now. So I think I'm going to have to get the one with a camera that actually works. Anthony, thank you very much. I've got a question which I think is going to sound slightly reactionary. And given that jazz music begins with a theme and then returns to the theme, I wonder if you've got anything that you might like to say about that sort of, not the beginning, but where the piece, in spite of the improvisation, ends up, which is to return to the theme. And I'm thinking about this in relation to what you had to say about John Coltrane, because one of the interesting things I think about the Love Supreme is the fact that by the time he came to record that particular album, he had moved a long, long way from his Christian roots. And that great sort of prayer that you find on the inside sleeve of that album is a kind of hymn of praise to a sense of the divine, which is no longer rooted in perhaps a Christian understanding of what the divine is. So I'm just wondering about perhaps where improvisation might actually take us if we're not too careful.
Yes, a great question. And I think there's two ways I would answer that. In the first instance, I would say that is part of the contestation. I mean, I think one of the challenges that one sees in jazz, and I think therefore, as a metaphor, like you see that in the context of Christian theology and biblical interpretation, is that sense of how far can you go before you've gone too far? That then means that what you're doing is no longer authentic to the original source. And at one level, I would simply acknowledge that contestation. My second response is a much more radical one, which will not please everyone, but as my general view is, as a Black liberation theologian, it's my job to accept people, so hey, here goes. As a post-colonial scholar and someone whose ancestors traversed Africa and the Caribbean, we have not always been Christian. As someone of African descent, we've not all been Christian, and I refuse to believe that my ancestors did not know God until racist white missionaries turned up and told them about a Jesus that didn't look like them. So therefore, my own view in terms of taking a post-colonial motif for theology is that I do not limit the divine simply within a Christian context. I don't do that. Now, having said that, I also recognize that when I'm invited to preach, there is clearly a framework in which my words have to be responsible, particularly given the fact that our preaching is not really dialogical. So it's very much a privileged position you have in the pulpit, where most people, certainly within the polite English context, you know, I mean, I'm not in a position to challenge you and say, I'm really sorry, but I don't know why you're saying that, and how you can believe that. So I will say that I do circumscribe myself within a preaching context, knowing the full well that I'm in a powerful position and I don't want to abuse it by imposing upon other people ideas and themes that they cannot challenge me on. But I would say for myself that if one's improvisation takes us beyond the bounds of conventional Christian doctrine, I guess my hermeneutic of suspicion would be, well, so what? So we're inventing those doctrines in the first place. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite books by an African-American scholar called Robert Hood. Book published in 1994, and the book is simply called Must God Remain Greek? Must God Remain Greek? And what Hood is pointing to are the varieties of African-derived religious ways of connecting with the divine, most of which were outlawed by white colonial regimes because they were seen as being transgressive and subversive. And basically, he simply makes a point of why is it that when people from the global south begin to synchronize the faith, it is abhorrent, but actually when white authorities did that, borrowing from particularly Greek ideas that were no more inherently Jewish than things that people in Africa and the Caribbean might have done, suddenly that's okay. So yeah, I mean, so in answer to your question, is contestation on the one hand, but I personally have no problem actually if the improvisation actually goes beyond the bounds of conventional Christianity, because I would then pose the question as to who defined those things in the first place, and we find that that is itself a product of whiteness and colonial power.
At the moment, there are no other hands up, so if there's anybody who wants to come in on that point in response and develop it, so to speak, as a teenager, I remember listening to Love, Devotion, Surrender in 1973, an album from John McLaughlin and Carlos Santana that actually was in tribute to John Coltrane, at a point that those two fantastic guitarists had actually embraced the teachings of Sri Chinmoy out of the Hindu tradition. So these things have their own kind of interesting dynamic. Anybody want to come back on that particular discussion, or indeed come in on any other point? Brunel James.
Anthony, Britain kind of embraced the cultural legacy of the Roman world as a culture at the same time that they embraced the slave trade as a core part of the economy. So I'm interested in your perspective on that dynamic, and also sort of taking it into the present day. Do you feel concerned that we now have a prime minister who explicitly identifies with, the Romans rather than the Hebrews, and is bringing in new legislation to make decisions about statues in the power of central government and secretaries of state, not at local levels where local communities can influence?
I think one of the best things about British history, and I say this as one whose first degree was in church history, but obviously at Birmingham University, is that it's not a simple linear story. That actually, I think one of the things about like the different sort of tributaries that feed into British history is that we have absorbed along the way lots of different influences and lots of different perspectives. So as you said, like we can embrace the Roman world on the one hand and embrace slavery on the other, but also have radical movements like the Lollards and the Chartists and various other perspectives that have been anti-imperial, anti-hegemonic. I think my concern has always been, with the likes of Boris Johnson, who was essentially English nationalist, is that what he wants to impose is a singular narrative around what constitutes British history. And whilst I think there's value in some of the things that he thinks are important, they're not the only story. They are alternative stories. And I think one of the importance of a place like Regent that actually that comes from a dissenting tradition of Christianity is that itself is a counter-narrative to a certain form of hegemony around how we understand religion and culture and traditions in the UK. So when I talk about sort of decolonizing the curriculum, for example, I'm not talking about taking stuff out. I'm talking about adding more stuff in. I'm not saying, okay, well, let's not teach the glories of British imperial past and Nelson and the Duke of Wellington. I'm saying, yes, let's have that, but then let's add in other bits of that story as well that then helps us to be a nation that is truly broad and deep and enables different people to find their points of contact within it. But what I find interesting is that I was on a panel, I think at some point last year, where like we were talking about sort of decolonizing the curriculum, and there was someone who was a conservative historian, I can't remember his name, I'll put it in the chat if it comes back to me, who was sort of challenging me around sort of wanting to sort of distort British history. But actually, as I said to the meeting, I said, actually, like, the only person who's distorting this is you, because actually you're the one who wants to close down the conversation. So his argument was, for example, that British children actually should only be taught about Florence Nightingale because like she's the true epitome of Britishness. I never argued that we should replace Florence Nightingale with Mary Seacole. I simply said, actually, but why aren't we teaching both, given that Mary Seacole paid her own money to go to the Crimea and was as significant and as popular in her own time at that moment as Florence Nightingale. So I'm not closing down the curricula, closing down debate. I simply want to amplify it.
Yeah.
Anyone else? We still got 12 minutes or so before we should close.
I see Emily has a hand up.
Ah, sorry, I hadn't spotted that yet. Yeah, come in then, please, Emily. And then also Chris joins, wants to ask a question as well. So Emily first, then Chris. We've got time for both, I think.
Okay, hi. Thank you all so much for this wonderful seminar. I continue to learn from all of you. And Anthony, I don't know if you've had time to read what I typed in the chat. You probably haven't, but it's interesting because as I typed it and I talked about white people and white churches, sometimes I said they and sometimes I said we. So that shows where I am on this fence. You know, I have to kind of examine myself and realize that I'm dealing with sort of a dual identity too, trying not to be associated with whiteness, but knowing that I am, and trying not to be complicit, but knowing that I am. And I guess that speaks to where I'm at. But the question really has to do with the audience or congregation. And if I heard you correctly, you seem to be saying that the congregation is part of this improvisatory process of preaching. And in my experience, and I know I'm overgeneralizing, but in my own experience, when I've gone to predominantly white churches, we don't interact with the preacher. We might not, but especially if we know them, but it's not the same dynamic that I've experienced at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in New Orleans, which is predominantly Black, and just a wonderful experience, very interactive. And so I'm thinking then that this transformative creation of something new that can come out of the preaching as improvisation doesn't happen as easily in the white churches, at least as I've characterized them here. So although we may be most in need of the transformation that could come out of this, and the understanding of ourselves as complicit and that whole paradigm shift, we are less likely to have that happen because we are not interacting with the preacher. And again, I apologize for generalizing because I think the Pentecostals do. So it seems like we're sort of complicit in that way, and we're sort of on that fence of safety because we're not interacting. Can you speak to this in some way?
Yeah, well, first let me say that the dynamic of a congregation that appears to be passive and non-responsive is not just a white thing. Okay, so let me just say that I've spent most of my time in very, very staid, respectable Methodist and Baptist churches where the congregation were polite and did not exactly shout hallelujahs and amens at a regular point. I mean, that's just not what English folk do, you know?
Oh, okay.
I'm reminded of a book years ago, and I can't remember the author, but it's called sort of Preaching, what was it called? Preaching with the Dead. And basically what the preacher was talking about was obviously as a preaching with this sort of community of preaching in the context of this sort of communion of saints. But I interpreted it at the time as saying, well, actually, I mean, I preached many a sermon night to a group of dead people who did not respond whatsoever. Therefore, I mean, I want to extend that slightly because I think there's a kind of idealized way in which I think a particular African-American I guess our cultural context responds, and so in British context, the equivalent of that might be Pentecostalism. I don't necessarily want to link it just to that. I think there is something about having people in that space with you, and when they sing a hymn, and when you do a reading, there may not be audible forms of response, but I think all of us know that there is still a fundamental difference between preaching in a space with people there and as I've done several times last year, and so preaching to a screen in this room by myself. The two are just so wildly different as to almost like to call it still church feels a bit odd.
Yes. Yes.
And therefore what I try to encourage congregations to do is to be authentic to themselves. So, you know, I mean, so I'm not going to sort of say to a group of very, very staid Methodists, well, you know, I'm like, you really must shout hallelujah because that will make me feel better. Right. Well, it wouldn't make me feel better, but, you know, I mean, I'm not saying you should do that, but what I'm encouraging you to do is to make contact with me. So there's something about how people look at you. There's something about how they nod. There's something about their gestures. There is something very, I think, important about, we'll look at the liturgical shape of worship, and it's not my specialism, but I think the hymn that we choose that leads into preaching and the hymn that we choose that leads out of it, I think they are crucial things in terms of how they help people out to connect with the message that is sort of sandwiched between it. So I think it's about how we think of this as a type of theatre, as a type of performance. And certainly a previous book I wrote years ago was called Dramatizing Theologies. And in Dramatizing Theologies, I was actually sort of working with the notion of the spectator that says that we can find a way that enables people not just be passive, but to feel that they are part of the process of what you're delivering. Then that then helps them like to have some type of ownership of it.
Right. Yes.
Thank you. Well, as promised, I give Christine Joines the possibility of coming in for the final interaction with Anthony before we must draw to a close. For this evening only, for many riches are to come in the following weeks.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Paul, and thank you for a great paper, Anthony, challenging as ever, and lots for us to think about. One thing particularly I was really keen to hear your feedback about was, because I think there's so much potential with this theme of jazz improvisation and how that could be applied for the purposes that you've outlined for us. But I was curious, you set me thinking about Jeremy Begbie and the work that he's done on jazz, and thinking that somehow he's not doing what you're encouraging us to do. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts about that. You know, for example, he writes about jazz being all jazz being rooted in a relatively stable stream of tradition, and to me that seemed to be somewhat counter to you seeing this as a destabilizing art form. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts, because I very much would like the jazz, the use of jazz to be one that went in the direction that you were encouraging us to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think very quickly, I think what Jeremy Begbie is drawing upon, and I've read some of his work, although I need to read more of it in order to sort of develop this paper beyond one chapter, book chapter, is that I think that there's some interesting dynamics even within jazz itself. So, you know, I mean, so you have some forms of improvisation that are very, very tightly controlled. And essentially what they're trying to do is to sort of preserve order. So they're sort of trying to create an alternative form of canon that can sort of rival sort of classical music. So, for example, if one looks at the work of Duke Ellington, for example, in the early 30s and 40s, like there's a sense in which he was very clear that what he was trying to create was an African-American form of sort of symphonic music. So, you know, I mean, that was very much about saying, I guess, it wants to extend that to preaching and theology, was to say, okay, well, how then do we find a form of neo-orthodoxy that says, actually, how then are we reinforcing and reinforming an existing tradition? That is very different from it's very different from, let's say, sort of Coltrane and Ornette Coleman in the 60s, who would move into what's called free jazz, which sounds pretty eclectic. It's like basically like you get on stage and like you just let it all hang out and you push it as far as possible. I'm clearly in the latter camp, not in the former camp. But I wouldn't dismiss the former camp, you know. So I'm not arguing that my approach is more authentic than his. I think we're just doing different things with it. And it may be that I think I'm right in saying that Begbie is an Anglican theologian. I don't want to make too much of that because obviously Anglican theologians come in lots of different guises. So I don't want to say, well, he's Anglican and I'm Methodist and therefore that explains, I mean, it probably doesn't explain anything at all. But I think just to say that we're doing different things with a similar art form, but that I think is consistent with the internal challenges in jazz itself in terms of what it represented. Does it represent an alternative form of symphonic music to say, well, actually, this is our own canon and it's written down, it's notated. So you got Bach and you got Ellington, or do you say actually, the whole point of it is to be so transgressive and subversive that you're doing something different and you're making up new rules as you're doing it. Both, I think, have their merits, but clearly I'm a Black liberation theologian, so I'm going to do the latter, not the former.
So thank you for that question, and thank you everybody who's participated either by listening or by raising questions and points, and Anthony for engaging with those so fully. Again, I think your own talk referred to making oneself vulnerable and being disturbing, and I think, you know, in how you've responded to some of these questions, in a way you've made yourself vulnerable by pushing your boat out beyond some of the boundaries that some are comfortable with, but you have disturbed us by making us think and be challenged intellectually and morally and socially. So thank you for that. And for those who can't get enough of that, Anthony returns in this series on Monday the 22nd of February in dialogue with the principal of Regent's Park College, Rob Ellis, around conversation on sport, religion and race. So there's further opportunity to hear Anthony, though he will be resuming his more usual role over the coming weeks as chairing these sessions instead of myself. And next week in particular, we look forward to the contribution from Professor Jane Shaw, who of course has a long history with Regent's Park College and has more recently returned to the University of Oxford as Principal of Harris Manchester College, Professor of the History of Religion and a Pro-Vice Chancellor in the university, and who will be addressing the theme of church, culture, women and academia. So another aspect of inclusivity and intersectionality with which we need to be concerned in this series. And for those of you who haven't got the full series session, I put up on the chat the link through to the entire programme, for which we hope you will join us in the coming weeks.
Paul, may I?
It's a great celebration.
Paul, may I interrupt?
Launch.
Sorry, it's Jane
Please.
Shaw, because that's not the lecture I think I'm giving next week.
No.
I'm sorry, have I?
I think I'm giving a lecture on mysticism and culture. Is that right? That's the one I've written. I could quickly whip up another, but it would be tight.
Then I must apologise, because it's quite possible that I picked up an earlier version of the programme just this evening. And sorry, and thank you for interjecting on that. So the correct title is
just Mysticism and Culture.
Mysticism and Culture. But I'm sure that also has to do somewhere with women and with church as well.
It does, it does, absolutely. There are women, and their interesting relationship to the church are in it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for making that correction.
Thank you for letting me
interrupt.
Thank you.
Read the wrong thing.
No, I just didn't want anyone to come for a lecture I haven't written, that's all.
And hopefully Anthony and Rob are indeed addressing race, religion and sports later on in the term. But anyway, the direct link to the authorised version, not the jazzed up version of falsity that I've given, you can find on that web link that I put into the chat. That goes straight through to the college website, and that should all be the correct information on which those who speak can improvise in the future. So thank you very much, and good night or good morning, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okie doke. I think that went nicely. Good engagement.
It did, yes, thank you. Thank you for chairing. Yeah, I think it was a good event. Thanks.
So, see you next week at the correct lecture. I must have I pulled one out of my file, a paper version that I brought with me when I came away. So it must have been from before Christmas sometime, and I hadn't rechecked on that. Okay,
take care. Bye.